well, I don't actually come from an art background. I I grew up in a very small town, and art really wasn't something we did. I didn't go to museums, so I didn't really discover it until I was a teenager. And I think through skateboarding is really where I discovered art. I think skateboarding is a very creative thing, and the idea of like, especially street skateboarding, you find places to do your tricks or whatever in like environments that you're not supposed to be doing them in, essentially. And I think there was something that was really fascinating about that. And then I had friends who, drew and painted, and it's sort of, when I started to watch what they were doing, I was like, I'd like to try this. And I kind of just, the first time I made a painting, I took a class at school, and it just felt like it was this one thing that, like, the first time in a while that like felt like I was meant to be doing it, and it felt totally natural. And it was a strange thing to do where you just feel like this is where I'm supposed to be all of a sudden. So, I just started obsessively drawing and took a few classes in school and accelerated very quickly into applying to art schools, and I got accepted. And, it was one of those things where I told my parents I was going to go into graphic design, and it's because, painting was not really a career to follow into. But of course, I always knew in my head I was going to be a painter. So, I was very lucky. I developed sort of quickly in school. I did a lot of photography, and that I started making bodies of work that was talking about, like when you take a photograph, you frame an image, and I was really interested in always like the things that were happening outside of the images. And I would find old photographs my mom would have taken, and I started printing basically her old negatives that I found. And, I was really interested in like, you see someone's foot there and like a patterned shirt. And I was kind of like, why, like what is happening there became more interesting to me. So I started making paintings that kind of was talking about that. And I would make these photographs that were very dense, lots of layers of like photograms on top of negatives. And then I would like go to the studio and make these giant, like super simple paintings, sort of talking about the same things, but just using elements of sort of like, my upbringing is very like working class. So it was sort of like, how do I bring a magical quality to the banal like life of a working class family? So the paintings just sort of became a thing where I focused on these like objects that were in the house and like placed them in different places in the painting. And it just, over time, the work just developed into like a more photographic, I guess, like the photographs fed more into the work and it became more complicated. And, I was very lucky as an undergraduate. I was discovered by a gallerist, and he started showing my work around, and it kind of happened very quickly. And I was not totally prepared to be an artist at that point because I was, in my 20s. But I started showing in galleries, and, I've had a strange career where I've sort of been like under the radar for the most part, but constantly changing the work as I've been growing. And, I'm like one of these, I don't believe in like, like when you find a certain body of work and then you just do that the rest of your life. I feel like, art should change just as much as we change from like decade to decade or day to day or whatever. And so I feel like I'm always, looking for different subject matter and trying to push the work to different places. I mean, I guess I feel like there's some key elements to my work that have always kind of been there. I guess, the working class, it's always been important to me that like work doesn't just speak to one audience. And because I come from a family that wasn't really interested in art, and because I love art so much that I wanted initially my early work to like, I wanted my parents to see the work and like understand it and like it, but also like, a very well-versed collector to also respond to the work. So there's always elements of, I guess, like a working class culture part of the work. Like I'm always talking, even if it's a very like subtle way. about like what it is to come from a working class sort of background, and sort of how art can be for anyone. And like when I was doing those photographic work, I started making really large paintings sort of as a point to be like, if there's these grand paintings made historically about religion or kings or whatever the subject, or like royalty, I was kind of like, why can't my family be on this like large scale? So I started making these paintings on like a really large scale about sort of that idea. So I think that's carried through the work. My newer work, I've kind of like gone to different paths through that idea, but I feel like the last few years I've focused again a lot more on those ideas and maybe how culturally that matters, I guess, in the work, how it can affect other people. And I think a lot of it has to do, like I feel like in the early work I was kind of focused more on who I was, and even though that's still important, as the world has changed very quickly in the last few years, and I've become more aware of like the culpability of who I am and where I come from, and like the people I come from and what that means. And so I think that's always part of the work. But I'm also interested in just like painting, like what it is to make a painting and why I make, why do I want to make paintings? And I think I think a lot of it has to do with like asking questions, but not really, I don't really want to give the answers, or I know the answers. It's almost about how do I make a painting that's always asking a question, and how can someone else connect to that question and ask themselves, what do they see in the image? I mean, I went to a fairly rigorous art school for an undergraduate, and I went from a very basic high school sort of experience of arts, like Picasso. We talked about like Picasso, but like I didn't know who John Singer Sargent was or other artists like that. That just wasn't something my teacher was aware of. So when I went to college, there was like we immediately were talking about postmodernism, and I was kind of like, what is this all about? And it made me like really look into the history, and we really like were rigorous about the history of art. And I think in a way they did that at school. Maybe it's my impression, but I feel like they really like dug it in. So when we got out, we sort of like let go of all of that. So I feel like when I graduated, I was kind of like, I'm done with like art history. I don't want to like think about it. I'm just going to make work that I want to make. And I think maybe that was kind of what their point was, to just like find yourself after knowing all this. So it's like always in the back of my head, all these different movements, and I love so many different kinds of painting. So I've never been the type who's like, I'm going to make this kind of work. Like I love surrealism. I love abstraction. And, I just think there's a way to like include all of those sort of forms of art in one image. And so I'm always just like, I'm just excited by like what painting can do. So I think, I don't actively study it as much as I probably should anymore, because, it's an interesting thing, because it's like always in your head and you see stuff and you're always thinking about things. But, I know also like, I don't want my influences to be too in the work. So I kind of feel like, I occasionally, I look at things I like, but, I don't really sit in the studio with like open books where like it's really, I feel like you can see a lot of artists where it's pretty obvious who they're looking at, because it's just like so in the work. And I always want my work to sort of be like referencing things, but not to look like anyone. It seems like an impossible idea, but I've always tried to make work that doesn't look like anything you can really historically connect to 100%. So it becomes like my work. And I don't know, I think that's an important thing to try to attempt, even if it's almost impossible. So there's a painting in my show at the Maki Gallery that the family liked, and I guess they basically wanted me to make a painting that was inspired by that painting. So I kind of, they were interested in the idea, I think, of the window and the cacti in the painting. And I don't usually make the same paintings. I kind of use the same subject matter, but I don't really, like, once I sort of construct an image, I kind of move on from initially that idea. But it was interesting, like as I started thinking of like, how can I expand this idea? And a lot of the work lately has been more about including like sort of windows, the idea of what a window is. It's not so much about like a lot of my work, it's not so much about what the definition is of this object or thing. It's sort of like what the idea is and what does that mean to paint something based on that. So, windows, like how do you make a window exciting, basically? And like the history of the window has been like through art, and like, and I was looking at Magritte when I made the painting that they first saw. And I was just always interested in, like, he was kind of like, he made that body of work, like he's painting windows, like paintings of windows, and like sort of he's almost busting the myth of like a window into the world. And it was the idea of like, how do I make a painting that's a painting of his painting, bursting the myth of the window into the world? And so it became a very layered idea. And it had to do with like the past few years with the pandemic, and we're always inside and looking out. And and almost like too, you live in cities, you kind of walk past people's windows, and kind of like reminds me like Vermeer, where you're like looking into someone's window, what's happening inside their space. And there was like a connection with my father passing right before the pandemic, where I was really thinking about what's happening inside your body and what you can't control, and sort of always wanted to be in and outside at the same time of spaces. So the kind of this painting was like really pushing the idea of like, what is a window? Like, there's a painting in the painting, there's like a representation of a painting, but is that the window, or is the window the painting, or is there a mirror that's actually the painting, or that's the window? So it's all these ideas of like screens, and I'm looking at you through like a window, and like, what does that mean in this time period that we live in? And the cacti was something that they really responded to. And for me, is another thing that like another object that everyone knows what a cactus is, but they come from these very specific places in the world, and sort of how culturally, how we find a cactus and we replace it in a pot in our own environment. And like I've read a lot about like cactuses are supposed to symbolize sort of like this ability to see beyond what the eye can see. So in this painting, the cactuses are bursting through windows and injecting into space in a way that is sort of like, I'm always trying to make paintings that seem like it's possible, but it's most likely impossible that it could actually happen that way. So there's always this sense of reality, but also a completely impossibility. I mean, I guess I feel like in some ways it always does for every artist. I always think it's strange when some artists are like, when they're like, my work is about like this specific event, and I'm kind of like, we're all sort of aware of, unless you're like in a cave, we all know what's happening in the world. So I feel like it's always coming into the world, and I try to not really date the work by putting anything very like politically of the moment, or any sort of like, I don't ever put like people that are recognizable, or I don't use like symbolism of anything in particular, except like very vague, very well-known sort of objects. And I think that gives it a timelessness. And I think there's a way to talk about what's happening without being so blatantly obvious. Usually, if I, when I did a body of work with whales, and it was kind of, inspired by the Trump situation in this country, like the political situation that was happening. And, it went back to my upbringing of like this working class versus the upper class, and like this difference in like the manipulation of the classes to each other. And so the whale was like representing sort of that idea. And so, I think like I didn't really intend for the window to like directly sort of be part of that, but of COVID. But like I said, like with my father, it was like his passing was very sudden, and it was about 3 months before COVID started. So I was still like processing what happened to him, and then this idea of COVID, and like as an artist, for me, I'm always questioning like why I'm making paintings. And you know, so and like for me, like this just still like that frame of like the painting is like there was just something that connected with COVID where like I was like, oh, there's this constant idea of this like framed, this square or rectangular sort of image that's just like always something in my head, I guess, that I'm always thinking about. And you know, it's just it seemed like it was like the most obvious, like I was like, you know, no one's actually thought about like that we're all just sitting looking out at through a window all the time, like waiting for this to end. So it became like, you know, how do I use this like really like basic shape to like really like open up like all these possibilities? And I think that's, you know, that's kind of, it's not something that like, you know, I could continue doing for 20 more years and it will not have to do with COVID anymore, but you'll still like, we'll all know that time of when we were sitting in home waiting for COVID to end. So I think it'll always sort of be something that can relate to a lot of people. You know, I mean, it's essentially like the whale was, it was kind of like it's such an iconic image historically that as I've been making different bodies of work, it's kind of just kept popping up and sort of like the tie to work together in some ways, but also I think, you know, because it's such a major sort of idea of, you know, like it's inspired by Moby Dick and the story that like informed Moby Dick and you know, and like sort of through each painting, I think my bodies of work have changed slightly, but again, like that sort of like cultural idea of like the working class and classes and, you know, cultural differences between people. And I think it's just a way to sort of like remind, you know, maybe it's not important that the viewer knows that that's what I'm doing, but it's sort of like, for me, a way to like tie the work together in various ways. And it's just because it's an image that, you know, can mean so many things to so many people that it's an interesting thing to kind of keep throwing into the work. I don't know exactly because I just, you know, I'm working and I think maybe a month, like technically I worked a lot on it from, you know, from beginning to end. And because it's a large painting, I'm able to like do areas and let them dry as I do the other side. And sort of, it was a very planned painting to get done at a fairly quick. So you know, if I had a year to work on it, maybe I would have taken longer, but it's also, I think why it's actually, I think why it's a better painting is because I didn't like sit and contemplate it too long. And I've had paintings that I overwork if I just sit with them too long. So yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing. I mean, I'm very grateful that I'm been able to, you know, that people have responded and that they want the work on their walls. And, you know, I've been very lucky that a lot of my work is not just gone to storage and is actually gone in people's houses. And I've had a lot of like, you know, like very different people respond to what I do. And, you know, coming from where I come from as the first person who's tried to be an artist and somewhat successful so far at it, you know, it's like a really, you know, it's important to me to sort of accomplish more than anyone in my family's history has ever done before. So, and for me to like, you know, to be able to be collected by, you know, great collections and really interesting people, it's like a really important and like feels like a huge step forward for my family, for my daughters, you know, in their life, that I'm able to achieve this. You know, I obviously just want to keep things moving forward. And, you know, I'm always trying to make the next great thing I can make. You know, I think I'm one of those people that as soon as I finish a painting, I think it's horrible and I want to do a better painting after that. So I'm never really satisfied with anything I make. And, you know, I have shows coming up and I'm just going to keep trying to push the work. And, you know, I'm hoping to make bodies of work that like touch a lot of different types of people and, you know, or more than just like pretty pictures on a wall.